This is Duke University.
Thanks for coming out. I know it's really fun to hear. We've decided at Kenan Institute to put on this series about ethics in sport, and then we realized after scheduling it that we didn't realize that when all the athletes do their practicing. So we're having our first two events. On this original schedule. So this is actually the second of two events. Here's a poster that you may have seen. So some of you might have been here for an event on global production marketing of athletes, and actually one or two of our presenters were there. This is the second event on bending the rules, gamesmanship and sports, or as I said on the previous slide, gamesmanship and sports and life, and other kinds of institutions. What it is that we learn about ethics in other forms of life, especially in competitive institutions, by thinking about sports. That's kind of our theme today. Our panelists who are in front of you, are listed here, are in order: Greg Dale, who's at Duke Athletics, is kind of the coaching guru, as I understand it, from athletes themselves, that they see you coming in and you work with their coaches and you work with them directly. And over right next to me is Jan Boxill, who, and I'll ask them to kind of introduce themselves a little bit as part of what they want to say about sports. Jan is the director of the Parr Center for Ethics at UNC, and she's a philosophy professor at UNC. She's a former collegiate basketball star, and she's the voice of the Lady Tar Heel basketball team, and I think also the voice of the Olympic women's basketball team on more than one Olympics on television. And between Greg and Jan is Joe Heath, who's, I should say, by the way, Jan is also really one of the, I think it's fair to say, one of the founders of the field of philosophy of sport and of the field as it's taught in university classes, and has the main textbook that's used, an anthology on philosophy of sport and sport ethics. And next to her is Joe, he's professor of philosophy at the University of Toronto and the School of Public Policy, I think. And Joe's written on lots of things in philosophy, ethics, economics, and other parts of life. Some of these are more popular books, at least popular amongst the chattering classes that chatter outside of universities. This one's called Filthy Lucre: Economics for People Who Hate Capitalism, and that's actually kind of a bit of a sell job, because it plays to them for the first half, and then it shows why the people who hate capitalism are also wrong in the second half. And actually, this book. So I was thinking, did I lend it to you, Rebecca? You will not find this book on the bookshelf.
I gave it back.
Looking like this, because the publisher thought that although people in Canada and Britain might know what filthy lucre means, Americans wouldn't know. So it's called
Economics Without Illusions.
Economics Without Illusions in America.
The buyer for Borders didn't know the meaning of the word lucre.
Yeah.
So that was it for that. Yeah.
And so a more philosophical text by Joe on Oxford University Press 2 years ago was Following the Rules, Practical Reasoning and Deontic Consent, which is nothing less than trying to understand why it's rational to be moral. And looking at almost every major contemporary tradition in empirical and normative ethics to get to that answer. And among other things, it uses lots of sports metaphors, or thinks about morality much as we think about sports. So I'm not going to say too much more than that. I looked at what some people were going to present in here, and I thought I would do a 2-minute blurb from something that I discovered. A number of people have put me onto a book by a very obscure philosophy book by somebody named Bernard Suits called Grasshopper, Games, Life, and Utopia. And I'll explain why in a minute. So one thing we might say is, why do we have rules in sports? So this is about rule bending and rule breaking in sports. So why do we have rules? And we shouldn't expect that that's a super complicated question. But we may ask, what is it about rule? What is it about sports, or what's the nature of sports, or what are sports that makes rules so important for them? And in terms of to ask that game, what are sports, we end up asking a more general and, if you will, more abstract question, what are games? Because, although we could contest it, but I think we would want to say, we want to say all sports are games, but not all games are sports. And I guess there could be some, there could be some running sports you might not want to think of games, but roughly speaking, a sport is a kind of a game. Not all games are sports, but things that involve, physical activity, etc., at least start to qualify as sports. And it's obviously an open question that we visit in many times in society when some particular thing deserves to be called a sport or not. So most recently, the courts weighed in, partly for Title IX reasons, on whether competitive cheer was actually a sport or not. So we end up visiting this question about what a sport is in order to partly to answer a question like that. So the question of what is a game is sort of interesting in part because most famous philosopher of the 20th century, Ludwig Wittgenstein, thought that you couldn't really answer that, or at least you couldn't give a good definition. He thought if you looked at all of the different kinds of games, from Ring Around the Rosie to Olympic Games to game fishing to soccer, you could see that there was what he would say was a kind of family resemblance between them, but there was no kind of essential core. There was no sort of special nature that made them all games and distinguished them from other kinds of activities. And that's where this obscure philosopher Bernard Suits comes in, who wrote things for professional philosophers in the 60s and 70s, that died recently, but he had left this interesting definition of a sport, and I think this just helps set up some of the things that we're going to talk about later. So a plausible definition of a game, and this would go for sports as well, that we might just want to keep in mind as we're talking about rules and rule breaking, is this. So it's a bit of a mouthful, and I've just kind of colored 3 or 4 different aspects of it. So to play a game is to engage in activity directed towards bringing about a specific state of affairs. So for example, in golf, it's to put the ball into the hole, and in soccer, it's to put the ball into the net, etc. Where the rules prohibit more efficient in favor of less efficient means. So the thing that makes that activity of bringing about some result kind of game-like is that you have some obstacle that makes it kind of more difficult than the easiest way to do it. So with golf, you have to actually swing this club at this little thing, and you have to do it as few times as possible. And that's sort of otherwise you could just pick the ball up and put it in the cup, and it wouldn't be much of a game. So using rules prohibit more efficient in favor of less efficient means, where the rules are accepted just because they make possible such activity. That's what it is for it to be a game. Now, if we start to talk about other competitive institutions like markets and firms and criminal law and electoral politics, we might want to think that these aren't just kind of arbitrary rules that we have, or they're accepted just for the activity, but that this is kind of the core of what a game is. And just a sort of shorter definition by Suits of the basic idea is that playing a game is a voluntary attempt to overcome unnecessary obstacles. And so we can kind of keep this in mind as we're talking about rules and rule breaking. And then just very quickly, and again, I think this just sets up what all of the speakers are going to talk about in one way or the other as we go on. So there are many different kinds and categories of rules in any given sport, and some of those reproduce each other from one sport to the next, and some sports have categories of rules that other sports don't have. Not all rules are written, and some rules have spirit. So we want to talk about the spirit of the rules in some cases when we're talking about rule breaking. Rules are bound up with how they're enforced. So when we think about rules, we also think about how you're going to monitor them and punish them. And that our views about the ethics of rule breaking vary across different categories of rules and violations. So not all violations of rules in sports, perhaps not even most violations of rules in sports are what we think of as cheating, or we think of as some kind of ethical transgression, but some would. So part of what we want to identify is, what is it about some kinds of rules that makes them so kind of essential to sportsmanship, and why is it that we want to call the breaking of some of those things cheating or think that it's unethical? And again, that's the sort of thing that we would think would carry over to other kinds of activities we have. So I've introduced folks now, and I'll ask them again if part of their intellectual or other biography fits in with what they want to say, that they should feel free to take some time to lay it out.
Thanks, Wayne, for inviting me. I, of course, work at UNC, have been there for a long time, but have been in many other places as well. And while Bernard Suits is an obscure philosopher for us who do philosophy of sport, he's probably the person who, he along with Weiss, got us started into this in the late 60s, early 70s. So I've been looking at this, and some of what Wayne has just said is precisely what I want to talk about a little bit first, because to evaluate sportsmanship and gamesmanship, in a sense, we do need to know what we're talking about. And I argue in almost everything that I write, it's that sports provides moral significance both for the society and also for this individual. Our moral senses are touched every day by all the public attention paid to sports, participation in the media, the attendance, and so forth. You can't, of course, now we've got how many television stations which are 24-hour sports. I don't know how many I can get. So we know that sport at its best promotes the virtues of honesty, respect, selfless teamwork, dedication, and commitment to the greater cause. And this idea actually, if you ever want to read something interesting, is to read about Naismith's invention of basketball. One of the more fascinating histories of any sport is in basketball. Basketball, he says, was made for principled play, not for profit. Thus, his new game was for athletes to enjoy playing and also be morally improved by playing, not for coaches, television networks, or corporate sponsors to control to their advantage. I wonder what Naismith would think of basketball today.
When was that quote from?
That's from Naismith's, it's a biography of Naismith, or no, it's Naismith's writing on the history of basketball. So it's fairly old. It also has the original rules of basketball, which are fascinating in themselves. And as when I talk about it, it's in my classes. There's only one rule that remains the same in basketball when it was enacted that it is today. And so I know now you're going to start to think about what would that rule be. And I'll tell you about it maybe later. but especially when we talk about changing rules. But sports force us to attend to our own moral positions, and how do we justify them? Sports lessons, good or bad, transcend the playing field, spilling over into the classroom, the business world, and the community, and contribute to shaping the character and culture of America's citizens. In acknowledging sport as a valuable national asset, we must be candid about the issues currently tearing at its fabric. There are those who place winning above all else and are willing to cheat for the sake of the goal at all costs. This willingness to prioritize winning at the sacrifice of ethics and health erodes our trust in sport and our inherent values. Ethics violations and the desire to win at all costs threaten the inherent value of sport in America. And I'm presently working with USADA, which I'm sure many of you know what USADA is, U.S. Anti-Doping Agency. And we just did a year-long, more than a year now, study on youth sports in America. And we did have 8,000 participants in the study from age 18 to adult, those who had children. And the two things that ranked high for them was what's eroding the fabric of sports is performance-enhancing drugs and cheating. And interestingly, they see bending the rules, which we'll talk about when we talk about gamesmanship and sportsmanship. They see bending the rules. Most of them saw bending the rules as a form of cheating. Then the question is, have they done it? And about 40% say they have, but they know of like many others who have done so. But what I argue about the sports being the moral significance is, and it's something what Wayne was sort of introducing, about the nature and design of sport. Sport does have a nature, and when we sort of think about the sports that we participate in, we usually think, because we're here at Duke or UNC, we think about the intercollegiate sports, which are significant. I think it's interesting right now in looking at rules, the one with pro football, with the hitting direct with the helmets. And I was supposed to be on a radio show at 6:30 this morning, but somehow we didn't get the call. But we're at New York, but it was all right. But anyway, we'll talk about it. So it's the nature and design of sport that I think provides the basis for principled play in a society. I don't attempt to give an exhaustive or a definition, but I do think that there's a paradigm which we can use to illuminate its significance. So I identify 4 features which I think are essential to the paradigm or the model that I'm using. First, and I think Bernard Suits has this as well, that in its paradigmatic form, sport is a freely chosen, voluntary activity designed for no end outside itself. Right? People certainly do play sports for different reasons, but sports are designed to be ends in themselves. As he said, you put up artificial obstacles. I mean, what a silly thing to put a ball in a hoop, or hit a ball in a net or something of that sort, right? And of course, you can participate in them for that reason, not for health or relaxation or show off, but just to play them, which we probably all did when we were kids. Participation in many sports is the expression of the individual's creativity and their freedom to choose, right? We have different body types, so we choose different ones as well. In this sense, sport, and he didn't use the term, but is an unalienated activity. That's an activity which exemplifies human creativity, autonomy, self-expression, and self-development, having no end outside itself. Though it may be served for other purposes, its activity is complete in itself, has no real relevance to society in those ways. The basketball court is artificially designed, right? The time, it says it's 20-minute halves, it's not 20 minutes, it usually ends up being a lot of minutes, right? Football is supposed to be, what, 15-minute quarters, and that would be 1 hour, but it ends, if it's on TV, it's many hours, right? So second, and Bernard Suits has this too, sports are rule governed, and there are at least two kinds of rules. One are constitutive rules that define the game and permissible moves, and these rules define the activity and are usually designed to develop and exhibit certain sets of skills and talents. Of course, some sports have more rules than others, and the rules change over time, right? But whatever the constitutive rules, their existence depends on their acceptance, and this will have a lot to do with our gamesmanship. To complement the constitutive rules, then there's regulative rules, and these include rules of fair play, of decency, and of safety. Rules of fair play include penalties for infractions of the constitutive rules and the moves of strategy within the game. For example, with football, you can't if you want to rush the passer, you can't cross the line of scrimmage, and so forth. Rules of decency reflect basic moral standards. For example, after a great tackle, the tackler can't just stand over a tackled player and taunt or gyrate. Now, that used to be okay, but it's not okay now, right? So, rules of safety are designed to protect the participants as they play according to the constitutive rules, right? And so, like, you can't grab the face mask, and right now the discussion in the pros about you can't hit head on with a helmet. I was surprised to see some of the pro football players really being opposed to this, right? And saying that this is what we're told. They want to see hard hits, they want to see injuries, people want to see this. We're told to go out and do these things. Why can't we do it? But in combination, the constitutive and regulative rules impose a discipline and create a safe and moral framework for self-expression and self-development. Both sets of rules are regularly evaluated and often changed to continue to promote competitiveness, safe, and a moral framework. The third feature, as was already mentioned, for a sport, they're physically challenging within the designated framework and rules, and this feature contrasts sports to games. Right? Games need not be physically challenging. Again, the constitutive rules are regularly and continually evaluated to keep the sports physically challenging. The example that I often use, some of you might remember that there was a rule that's presently in men's basketball that was disallowed between 1967 to 1972, I think. You know what that is?
Dunking?
Dunking, exactly. So I was at UCLA at the time at the same time as Jabbar, and it was during the Jabbar years that rule was disallowed. And I think for two reasons. One, because they thought it wasn't physically challenging for someone of Jabbar's stature, and also to keep the game competitive and unfairness. If you remember, if you dunked in either practice or warm-ups or during the game, it was an automatic technical, even if it was in the warm-ups. So the last game that Jabbar played at UCLA, he did start the game by dunking, and so started it with the technical. So the final feature of sports is it involves competition in a mutual challenge to achieve or strive for excellence. And this is actually what's important, I think, when we talk about sportsmanship and gamesmanship. So there's an attempt to secure a victory within the framework set by the rules, both constitutive and regulative, where the struggle involves both the process and the product, the desire to win, the desire to be tested. And it's in this where the mental and physical all come together, where competition either leads to respect, friendship, or combat, or where you view your opponents, where you either view your opponents as partners in a cooperative challenge or struggle, or as enemies to be conquered. I was talking to Rebecca earlier, and we were talking about this movie, Heart of the Game, right? And I don't know if any of you have seen it, but we will be watching it sometime soon. And oftentimes, how do you motivate players? Do you use kinds of things that you might not think would be appropriate to motivate your players to go out and play hard? Right? I mentioned one motivation that the University of Alabama used, when was it, 1992 we discovered? Does anybody know what Alabama used once to motivate their players after a particularly
Against
shot that?
Mississippi State?
Was it at Mississippi State?
Well, no, was it against, when he castrated the bull?
Yes, and he castrated the bull on the field.
Yeah,
right?
Stone.
Yes, right. So, are these appropriate things? This is kind of, this is out of bounds, right? So, but obviously this is a model. So when I present this paradigm, it is a model, right? And it's, of course, we deviate from it in practice. And that's not unlike any other things that we do as well. And it's in this sense that we see most clearly the moral significance of sports, where we begin to understand and evaluate sportsmanship, gamesmanship, bending the rules, and cheating. We all have a sense of what sportsmanship means as an essential element in competition. We also have a sense of what cheating involves and that it undermines the essential elements of competition. Sportsmanship, or as I sometimes use sportspersonship, is an attitude that shows respect for fellow competitors as mutual participants. It requires fairness, generosity, courtesy, grace in winning and in losing. Respect for opponents as fellow competitors and for the integrity of the sports contest is also. Sportsmanship is everybody's responsibility, and the key is respect. And I think when we look at any of the things that are done, right, whether for strategizing, bending the rules, and so forth, it all comes around to respect, and that's the same thing translated into society. Cheating undermines respect and is best defined as the intentional violation of a public system of rules in order to secure the goals of that system for oneself or with others that he or she is concerned. Cheaters fail to respect their opponents as persons, as agents with their own purposes of their own, by violating the public system of rules that others may reasonably expect to govern the activity in question. But how competition is practiced, of course, may differ from how it ought to be. While cheating in straightforward cases may be non-controversial, for instance, the golfer deliberately not counting all the strokes, or a coach sending the wrong player to the foul line. Other cases are not so straightforward. The intentional foul, delay of the game, penalty for a strategic advantage. These strategies involve the intentional violation of rules of sport to gain a competitive advantage. There may be common agreement among either to use or not to use them. And in fact, we have rule changes that actually reflect these strategic fouls. There was a time, I think, I'm not sure whether it was pro, I think it was in pro, where we all know about the Shaq attack, but there were others before Shaq, where you could have, in order to lessen the number of those strategic fouls, they would actually, you had the option of either shooting the free throw or taking the ball out of bounds. And I think they only tested that for a year. I'm not sure how long that went, but it would be interesting to see. And they discuss that every so often, whether they want to change that rule. So the strategies involve the intentional violation, even though there might be common agreement among them. But are these cases of cheating? Right? Now, interestingly, when you push the rules and bend the rules, in this case what they're doing, is it cheating? And I think we would probably say in this case it's not cheating, but it is what's often referred to as gamesmanship or courtcraft. And some might say it's bending the rules or pushing the rules to the limit without getting caught, using whatever dubious method possible to achieve desired end. That's how Sharon Stahl, I think, and Jennifer Beller defined it. So I look at sometimes in sports, it's the same kind of things we do with music and art. We push the limits of what's given to us to sort of see what's going to be acceptable and what isn't. And we often change the rules by people pushing the limits. But it's in all kinds, if you look at the NCAA rule or bulletin, what is it called, the NCAA manual, right? When I first started, I forget when women were first participating in 1980, right? So it was AIAW, and then 82, right? The rule book was pretty slim, okay? By the time, I forget what year it was, and if you looked at it, and if you really went through it, if you're trying to find a case, they have cases in the back, and you can easily find contradictions, right? But then they scrapped it and start all over again. It's now about time to scrap it and start all over again, I think. So it's gotten to be that big, partly because we have pushed the rules. And there are some rules in there, I remember when Florida was found with 150 violations, they were really like giving a t-shirt to a recruit, giving a hat to a recruit, and each one of those were several violations. And so it's not just in the rules of playing, but you see the rules in all kinds of ways. But we use the model of the mutual quest for excellence And it helps us to eliminate some of the disagreements. If we keep in mind that sports are designed for no ends outside themselves, this also helps, right? But we are still human, and we come with human fallibilities, so there's always going to be failings. That is why the rules of sport, constitutive and fair play and decency, play a significant role both in sports as well as in society. Within the game, the ground rules are accepted. They may be manipulated for strategy, right? But they must not overstep prohibited ones without swift punishment, for instance, fighting and biting and so forth. So, and we don't, and generally, how do we analyze it in terms of respect? And we can talk about that later. One purpose of the rule changes is to demonstrate the respect for the challenge itself by treating each other as challengers, not as enemies, but in so doing, the anything goes mentality is diminished. At the end of the competition, we all know what happens at the end of competition. Usually, it's shown by the handshake or the hand clap. Here, the symbolic gesture, it is a symbolic gesture, and I think most people don't pay attention, but actually it's a way of showing respect and saying, thanks, friend, for the challenge, because when you think about it, you can't have the game without both competitors participating. You are participating in a shared end, and that shared end is the desire to have a good outcome. And so sometimes you know you're not going to win, and sometimes you know you're going to win, but you still have to go through the process. But now when the goal comes outside of the game, or when winning at all costs is the end, morality is debased and respect is diminished. Your opponent is seen as an enemy in combat or an obstacle to their success. When the focus purely is on winning, it undermines the passion and mutual respect. While there is a desire to win, it's in the context of the game being played for the game itself, for self-development and for self-expression. If you focus solely on winning, then losing becomes devastating and the process becomes secondary, and testing the rules begins. Thus, it's important to keep a proper focus for striving to achieve excellence within the paradigm of sport, and how focusing solely on winning undermines this. If competition in sports is thought as a mutual challenge to achieve excellence, then cheating, disrespect for the game, and bad sportsmanship are different ways, each of violating the ethics of what should apply to the good competition. To quote Bob Simon, a defensible sports ethics, and one that respects participants as persons, should avoid the twin errors of, on the one hand, leaving no room for strategic tactics, such as a clever strategic foul, or on the other hand, assuming that any behavior that contributes to the victory is morally acceptable, which sometimes we lead to. Because, as I will argue in the reason in society as well in sports, the death of ethics is the sabotage of excellence.
Thank you very much, Jim. Actually, I like a little... If you don't hear it, then you realize how unnatural it is. So thanks for the good game she brought. So let's just move on to Joe, and then we'll sort of have
Switch around?
Yeah.
we'll have the three presentations, and then we'll have a sort of wide open discussion after that.
Okay, so I wanted to talk mainly about competition and competitive sport, and that's actually the primary reason that I'm interested in the topic, and I found myself sometimes reading philosophy of sport, is that I'm interested in competition, mainly because I do some work in business ethics, and I think that business ethics and a variety of domains that Wayne sort of rolled off. There are what we call in the trade adversarial institutions, where people have been explicitly set up in a competitive environment. And I think that markets are one of those cases. Actually saying that markets are competitive interactions is, believe it or not an uncontroversial view in business ethics, so you have to defend it. And philosophy of sport is very helpful in that respect, because the thing about sport is, because of its various pedagogical and instructive values, the fact that we think that it's useful for children to participate in team sports, builds character and so on, we tend to have in sport much more explicit articulations of the values and ideals and the purposes of it, because we have to explain to kids what we're trying to accomplish. And we try to explain, like, I have a 6-year-old, and we've been playing card games because I'm trying to explain to her what gloating is and why you're not supposed to do it. And card games are a very good way of illustrating, see, that's gloating. And you have to learn not to do that. And that's a general life lesson. So sport is very helpful because of that explicit articulation, often related to its pedagogical value. So I became interested in the question. Now, competitive sport, I just wanted to say an aside. I was reading this hilarious article about competitive yoga. Have you been following this? That I would find intrinsically hilarious. But it's really classic. The yoga comes to North America, and what do we contribute to it? Well, competitive yoga, right? So you call that chaturanga? I'll show you chaturanga. You know, I can get to loss of self before you can. Anyhow, may be the case that not all sport is competitive, but certainly a lot of it is, and we have a cultural disposition towards competitiveness in sport. And I think that in order, though, to get clear on the ethics then of competition, of competitive behavior, adversarial behavior, you have to get clear on sort of the fundamental action theory of it, like underlying underlying the interaction. How is it that people are oriented towards the interaction? And I think that the reason adversarial ethics is tricky, and that there are tricky aspects to the ethics of sport as well, is that most of ethics, it has as its general purpose getting people to behave more cooperatively. And as a result, golden rule reasoning is extremely powerful in moral domains generally. Right? So when you tell people to tell you say to children, you should tell the truth. And they say, why should I tell the truth? And you say, well, if everybody lied all the time, then you could never trust anything, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So there's that kind of what if everybody did that constraint, which you then try to inculcate. And then if people respect that, then they'll act in a more cooperative way. Then they will avoid a certain class of collective action problems. So you can wind up with social outcomes that are mutually beneficial because people are behaving cooperatively. Now, I think what's trickiest about competition is that, from a moral point of view, is that competition is sort of the opposite of that. Namely, rather than using various instruments of social control in order to try to promote cooperative behavior, what we do in the case of competition is we allow people to act in a non-cooperative fashion. Not only do we allow that, we in many cases actively encourage it. And so at the core of a competition is a collective action problem, where people are acting in a way that actually makes everybody involved in the competition worse off. Now, why would we ever do that? Well, it's because the competition is structured in such a way that their activities also produce beneficial byproducts. And the value of competition lies not in the specific outcomes that people are achieving through their behavior, but rather those byproducts. So that's what I'm going to try to explain and justify. And to give you an example of this, I'll use an example from an economic context, and then try to show how it generalizes to sport. So I was just fishing around for an example of it. So when we were kids, one year, we lived on like a little sort of hobby farm, and we had a potato beetle infestation. And so there are 3 of us kids. I have 2 brothers. And my dad gave us each a coffee can and said, I want you to go pick potato beetles off the potato plants. I'll give you $1 for every can of beetles that you pick. And so we went out with these espresso cans, like pretty big cans, and spent the day picking potato beetles. And in retrospect, this was kind of gross. But then at the end, when we had our full can of beetles, we bring them to my dad, and he would throw them on the fire, and then he'd give us $1. All right, so there's a simple sort of economic activity. He's motivated. If he had just told us we had to do it, we would have picked maybe half a can. But by offering us the economic incentive of $1 per can, I think probably my older brother and I, we each picked at least 2 cans that day. Now, suppose that my father was even more fiendish, and instead of offering us this economic incentive, instead said, guess what, kids, today we're going to have a potato beetle picking competition. That is, I will give $5 to the kid who picks the most potato beetles. You know, go for it, right? And so, and released us into the potato field. It's not inconceivable he would have done that. And I think that, therefore, he probably spent $6 on us when we actually went out paying. So he could save himself a bit of money simply by offering $5 to the winner. And chances are each of us would have picked even more potato beetles. Because rather than simply getting $1 per can, we had a chance at winning 5. That's a big payoff when you're 8 years old. And so what's happening there is that it's because of what matters suddenly. He transforms the game in such a way that what matters is not the absolute number of potato beetles that I'm picking. What matters is the relative number. What matters is that I pick more potato beetles than my brother. Right? You know that joke about maybe this is a Canadian joke, that the 2 guys are camping and all of a sudden they see a bear. The bear comes running at them. And one guy starts to run away. The other guy stops and puts on his shoes. And the guy says, what are you doing? Putting your shoes on isn't going to help you outrun the bear. And the guy says, I don't have to outrun the bear, I just have to outrun you. All right, so that's the point. So what matters when there are 2 of you running away from the bear is that you have to run faster than the other guy, not faster than the bear. So in other words, it transforms it so that it's your relative achievement that matters, not your absolute achievement. And that's why competition is powerfully motivating, because it has this ratcheting up effect, where whenever somebody else does better, then in order to even retain your position, you have to go out and do even better. And then, of course, that's the non-cooperative aspect of it as well. In other words, when I go out there and start frantically picking potato beetles, I'm clearly worsening the anticipated outcome for both of my brothers. Right? They have a lot better chance of winding up with nothing at the end of the day because I'm out there so aggressively picking beetles. And in fact, had my brothers and I been smart, and maybe this is why my dad never thought to organize this competition, you can see that it's non-cooperative, the competition, because there's an obvious incentive for collusion there as well. So say my dad sets up a potato beetle picking contest, and the three of us realize, you know what? He's just playing us off against each other. The fact is, he's got to give the $5 to the winner, no matter how many potato beetles we pick. So why don't we just take it easy, we'll go out the field, we'll relax, maybe go down to the river for a bit, come back, each of us can pick a little bit, and then one of us will win, we'll just split up the earnings, and then ta-da, we're done, right? So we could have easily defeated the competition by colluding with one another. Now, the competition, therefore, then that's cooperation, right? That way, we're actually together, rather than fighting against each other, we're pooling our assets, we're coming up with an outcome that's better for everybody, right? That, from our perspective, we all get to enjoy the day a lot more by taking the afternoon and going down to the river, rather than practically picking potato beetles. So when I say that it's not only a socially tolerated form of non-cooperative behavior, it's a socially mandated, it's in many cases an institutionalized form of non-cooperative behavior. The rules often prevent that type of collusion from developing. Now, I think that a sporting competition has exactly, that's just the generic structure of competition. You take a collective action problem, which normally worsens people's condition, and you structure it in such a way that it produces a beneficial outcome. In this case, it's the potato beetles getting picked. It's the beneficial byproduct. Now, sport has, I think, the same structure, but it's harder to see, partly because of the self-imposed nature of the competition. But the best example of this analysis comes from the movie Chariots of Fire, where people are training, or quote, training for long-distance running. And long-distance running is kind of like potato beetle picking, in that, with the potato beetle picking, probably my older brother would have won, just because he was older. And so he was more dexterous and would have been able to do it more quickly and so forth. In other words, he had the greatest natural ability at potato beetle picking, and he simply would have won. Well, with a lot of athletics, if you just were to spring a competition on people unexpectedly, so one day you walk into your moral philosophy class and you say, guess what, today we're doing a long distance run. And everybody goes off and runs. Now, who's the person who's going to win? Well, the person with the most natural ability is the person who's going to win. But there is available a free rider strategy to the person who has less natural ability. If they get wind of this in advance, they can sneak off and they can do this thing called training, whereby they can improve their chances of winning, even if they're not the most naturally talented. Now, as soon as one person sneaks off and starts training, then of course the naturally talented have no choice but to start training themselves. But I mean, that's like when I see my brother pick a can of potato beetles, I have no choice but to go out and pick at least a can myself, right? In other words, you have to match their achievement. But then as soon as the naturally talented start training, say 1 hour a week, then everything's back to the way it was before. The naturally talented are still going to win. It's just that everybody's working more in order to achieve that outcome. So then the untalented might go out and even sneakier. They might train for 2 hours. And that has the effect of ratcheting it up. Right? So I mean, that's the mechanism which makes sport more competitive, makes training more intense as time goes by. That is a form of non-cooperative behavior. And in Chariots of Fire, the long-distance runners had kind of gotten wind of this, and so they basically colluded, the same way my brothers and I might have colluded, where they would have said, you know what, so-and-so's going to win no matter what, so why don't we all just relax and have nobody train? And that way we all save ourselves a lot of time and energy, nothing's really affected in the outcome, right? So you had this basically a cartel amongst the long-distance runners. And then the hero is this new guy who comes up, who's like spindly or whatever, but he insists on training. And he breaks the pact. Now, I mean, that may seem sort of fanciful, the Chariots of Fire version of it, but this colleague of mine who's Brazilian says that there was something very similar that happened in soccer, starting in the 1980s, where as a Brazilian he was very sensitive to this. That is, the average number of kilometers run by a soccer player in a game has increased dramatically in the last 30 years. And to the intense irritation of the Brazilians, and South Americans generally. So all the way until the early 80s, the game was played in a fairly relaxed pace. And as a result, the players used to be able to smoke and spend evenings in nightclubs, and it didn't really impair their ability. And then the Brazilian perception was that one day all these German fitness fanatics showed up, who insisted on running around at full speed constantly during the games. And that was sort of spoiling it for everybody. So prior to that, there had been sort of collusion where, it looks like the ball's going out. We could all just run, fast to try to stop it from going out. But you know what? if we just sort of let it go out, chances are it'll come out even. Half the time it'll be in your favor, half the time even. So there's no point getting all excited chasing down those balls, right? And all of a sudden these Germans show up, we start chasing down all the balls, and that forces everybody else to do exactly the same thing, right? So a lot of South American soccer players were really irritated at the level of physical fitness that was required with the new European style of play. That's an example of sort of tacit collusion on how much you want to compete with one another. So I think the general analysis is applicable to sport, even though there's some variations to it. So sport is it's sort of, it's a little complicated, but there's a sense in which it's bad for the players because they're competing with one another. And that ratcheting up in effect is not in the interests of the players. And so why is the activity as a whole valuable? The activity as a whole has value because of the byproducts that it generates. Now, those byproducts can include benefits for the players, like improved physical fitness and so forth, right? But that it's not first and foremost the intention of the players to produce the benefits that justifies or creates the social value of sport. The social value of sport is largely a byproduct of it, and that's a generic feature of competition, economic competition as well. It's not what firms are trying to accomplish in many cases that constitutes the social value. There's a byproduct of their competitiveness that produces the value. And so therefore, I think that the central concept in the ethics of sport needs to be that of healthy competition, where healthy competition is basically occurs when you have a system of rules that encourages people to compete in a way that generates the relevant set of byproducts, that generates the valuable social outcomes. I think, however, that it creates a constraint on the extent to which we can require, what's I say, moral conduct on the part of players. Right? That is, because the competition has as its core a relatively antisocial set of motives. In other words, in a competition, your primary objective, I mean, it's a permissible objective to be concerned exclusively with winning. Right? That is, beating the other person, being better than the other person, as an objective is permissible in sport because that's what creates the little engine that ratchets up effort, that constantly increases the level of performance. And that is fundamentally an antisocial impulse. Right? So the same way wanting to pick more potato beetles than my brother is a permissible feature of the competition. But it does result in a worse outcome for my brother. And I have to not be concerned so much with what this is doing to my brother and be primarily concerned with my own interest in order for the competition to work properly. And so the golden rule reasoning as such cannot be directly applied to sport. Because it's not only are people permitted to act in a non-cooperative fashion, they're positively encouraged to act in a non-cooperative fashion. And that makes it an exception from the sort of standard ideas of everyday morality, which is what you think, well, what if everybody did that, and so on. So you cannot insist that athletes be virtuous in the everyday sense of the term. The competition itself can have virtue because it generates positive outcomes. But the athletes themselves don't have to actually intend those positive outcomes. So we can talk about this later, but I actually had a lot of, I remember I was taken aback, like most people, by Charles Barkley's I'm not a role model ad. But I actually found it exactly right when I saw it. He's saying exactly the right thing. And that, well, we can talk about this, but I always thought it was absurd the extent to which people thought that Michael Jordan needed to be a virtuous individual. People used to get all upset about him gambling. As though somehow he was supposed to be a better guy than the average person, right? And I thought Barkley really just sort of called the bluff on the whole thing. He just said, like, we're just out there trying to win. And whether or not the whole thing has social value is not the concern of the athlete, it's the concern of the people who make the rules. So I think it's tricky then saying, in terms of evaluating gamesmanship, what is it that counts as going too far? You can't say that the athletes have to be concerned with the value of the sport, because that's just antithetical to the nature of competition. So I have a line that I liked in sort of dipping into the literature on ethics of sport from Warren Fraley?
Warren
Fraley? In his book, Right Action in Sport. He defines it, I think he hits the nail right on the head. He defines it as, he said, a good sports contest is one in which the personal intended ends of action are congruent with or consistent with the purposes of the sport competition. Right? Now that's valuable because of what he's not saying. Right? In other words, he's not saying you have to intend the purposes of the sport, the good purposes of the sport competition. It's just that your intention has to be at least consistent with the good purposes of the sport competition. And that actually, perhaps we can talk about it later, but I think that actually does an enormous amount of work when it comes to analyzing, in particular, gamesmanship and areas of gray region, where the rules don't prohibit something, but nevertheless, there's an exploit available. Is the person going too far? I think that can be answered by asking the question, is that consistent with the purposes of a sporting competition? And that's a lower moral standard, but I think it's the appropriate one for talking about sport.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Joe. We already have,
Yes.
we already have debatable material.
Yes. So these two are really the experts in the world of ethics. My background is as a coach and a teacher, and at the middle school and high school level, I work here in the athletic department at Duke as the sports psychologist, so I work every day with our coaches and athletes, obviously particularly on the mental aspects of performance. I do teach an ethics class, a sport ethics class, and I travel the country speaking to coaches and parents about creating an environment where kids can be successful, and how do we keep this whole thing about winning and competition and all those things in perspective. And so I just want to give you some of my thoughts, particularly from that perspective. And the first time I ever really became aware of this whole idea of gamesmanship, I was coaching a basketball team, a middle school basketball team in New York City, coaching an all-boys private school. And these are 7th graders, and we were playing a team from East Harlem. And the history was we never even came close to this team, never even close to them. But my very first year, guess what? We were down we had 3 seconds left in the game, and we were only down by 1 point. It was because of my great coaching, I'm sure, the reason why we were down by 1. So I called timeout after one of our kids makes a great shot, and I called timeout because we have to design a play to try to steal the ball to try to hopefully win the game with 3 seconds left. And as the young boys are walking over, I have no idea what I'm going to say right now because I've never been in this situation. But at that moment, as they all sat down and I turned to them, I remembered that these kids that we were playing against play a lot of street ball. So in other words, they play pickup games all the time where there are no officials or nobody there to govern their games. And if you know anything all about street ball, is that if Jan is bringing the ball, if she's inbounding the ball to her teammates, if I'm guarding her, if I'm guarding the inbounds, what I do to make sure that my defensive team is ready, I'll say check, right? And I'll have her bounce the ball to me or give me the ball. I'll look around, make sure everybody's ready after I say check, and then I'll give her the ball back. And then she inbounds the ball, right? So I told our young man who was guarding the inbounds pass that as soon as the official gives him the ball, you need to be 3 steps back. As soon as he gives him the ball, I want you to yell check. Okay? I'm not kidding. My kid yells check. This kid bounces my kid the ball, takes 2 bounces, shoots a layup, and we win the game. And I'm running around like Jim Valvano at 24 years old. And I look over that young man, I hope he's okay today. I'm worried about him. He's over there crying on the floor, devastated. But in that moment, it made me realize that, winning to me in that moment was more important than anything else. And in my mind, I didn't know what it was at that time, but that was an example of gamesmanship. And I'm not sure at what age we learned that. 2 of my boys, they used to have this competition, and they were 6 and 3 at the time that this incident happened. But they would strip down to everything but their boxer shorts and run around the corner and run up the stairs to see who could beat the first one to the top of the stairs. And my 3-year-old continually got beat regularly, right? Well, this one time they go through the hallway, go around the corner, and start to head up the stairs. They take 3 steps up the stairs, and he reaches over, who's the kid in front, pulls his underwear down. The one who's beating pulls the 6-year-old's underwear down, runs to the top of the stairs, and he's going, I won. Because the 6-year-old had to stop and pull his underwear back up. And my son was very proud of the fact that he had done that and didn't see anything wrong with this idea of, hey, I wanted to win, I was losing, so that was a method for me to be able to win. And I like to think I didn't teach him that, but he learned at a very early age that's what he needed to do. But as I said, I spent a lot of time with coaches, and with parents, trying to get them to realize the impact. And I think Jan is going to share some statistics here in a little bit from that study that she's doing and talking about the impact that coaches actually do have on athletes. And one of the things, two things I'd like to talk about is I ask coaches regularly, what is your definition of success? And from the college level all the way down, and I have yet to have one coach publicly say winning was the most important thing to them. Never do they say, even at the college level, they'll say it's on their list, but it's nowhere near the top. But then as we go through the workshop, we begin to challenge them, and how they behave on a daily basis shows that winning is ultimately the most important thing, and their behaviors demonstrate that. And they teach, I would argue, they teach kids at a very early age this idea of gamesmanship. There are soccer coaches that teach kids how to pull jerseys on a kid who's beaten them, learn how to pull that jersey without being caught by the official. And we're teaching 7 and 8 and 9 and 10-year-olds how to do that. And really trying to help coaches understand that they do have a big impact on kids and what happens when they do try to teach them these devious methods of winning, and showing them, helping them understand that winning then becomes the most important thing. It's interesting, when I talk to parents and ask them, what are the lessons, and I'll even state it, values, that you want your kids to learn as a result of being in sport. Does anybody have any idea what parents might say when I ask them that? What do you hope your children learn as a result of participating in sport? What do you think parents might say? Anybody have an idea?
Teamwork.
Teamwork.
Fair play.
Fair play. Very seldom, but sometimes, yes. What's that?
Being a good sport.
Yeah, so they'll say sportsmanship, yes.
Discipline, responsibility.
Discipline, responsibility, and yes, and we go on and on and on. And what happens is that most of what they talk about is what we consider non-moral values or social values, that they want them to learn loyalty and dedication and commitment and work ethic, and all those are great things, and children perhaps can learn those things from participating in sport, but when they seldom, but every now and then they'll say sportsmanship. So the one thing I ask them is, are you modeling sportsmanship in the way you interact with officials during games? And not so many, right? Or is your spouse or significant other too embarrassed to sit by you because of the way you behave during in the stands? And you can see people giving each other elbows when they do that. But I would argue, and I try to help them understand, that just because your child participates in sport does not mean their moral character is going to be developed in a positive way. And try to help them understand that we have a responsibility to try to help develop that. If, in fact, because we hold sport as this virtuous, I think, in many places, is this great place where we can learn all these lessons about life. And I happen to believe that for every kid that his or her moral development might be, moral character might be developed in a positive way, there's one or two that it's not. And I see it every single day, that they're learning very early on that we need to do whatever we need to do in order to try to win. And try to help them understand that the reason perhaps why we do these dubious methods and why we participate in gamesmanship is because we value winning more than anything else. That winning is valued over honesty, it's valued over sportsmanship or fair play. Ultimately, winning is the thing, as you talked about, is that it's rewarded, right? And that there's a lot of rewards for the person that is winning. I worry that it's going to continue to go lower and lower. In Dallas, Texas, they have a soccer league for 18-month-olds now, so these kids aren't even as tall as this table here. They can barely walk. But they have a structured, organized league for these kids that are 18 months old. And are they going to be teaching them how to grab those jerseys as they go along? What's that? Take the diapers down in order to be able to diaper pulling, right? They're going to be able to do that. So I really have a passion for trying to help coaches understand the impact that they do have on kids, and that our kids can develop this moral character. It is possible, I think, but it is very difficult based on this idea, as he talked about, with the way competition is set up, that it's really, we reward the winner. So by its nature, we create this situation where we have to compete with each other. And the question becomes, can we compete with each other without having to participate in gamesmanship or without cheating, without bending the rules in order to win? Can we do that? Can we line up and just see who's the best athlete today? It's interesting when I teach my ethics class for undergrads here at Duke, we had a senior that she said, this is the first time in my life that anybody's ever talked to me about ethics in sport. And what is cheating and what is not cheating. Now, whether maybe her parents perhaps taught her that and she just didn't pick up on it, but it's the first time for many of these kids that they ever question sports and what is considered gamesmanship and what is acceptable and what's not acceptable. And it's really an interesting dynamic in that class anyway, that coming in, they blindly just accepted sport the way it is, but by the end of the semester, many of them were questioning these dubious methods. And it's interesting when I talk to our coaches about it, they don't like the fact that I'm talking to these kids that are on their teams about how do we play this game and try to play it ethically. Because they want to win, and their jobs depend on winning. So they don't necessarily, they joke around about it, but they're not necessarily happy with the fact that I'm trying to talk to their kids about how do we play this game ethically. So again, these guys are the experts. I just want to kind of provide my perspective as a former coach and somebody who works with coaches and tries to educate parents and coaches about this idea of gamesmanship.
Okay, well, thank you. So, what I see is actually from all three, I mean, we can figure out whether there's consistency or not, but in a way, we're seeing how different things look from different perspectives. So, to the perspective, if you're in the game, it looks different than if you're the league official designing the rules, or if you're the television network, or if you're the parent, or if you're in the game only because you're trying to advance your interest in some larger game, like getting onto another team or getting a bigger salary or something. So depending on which perspective you have, all of this sort of nexus of things that are coming together in and around sport will look very different from those different angles. Even if it's conceivable that all three presentations were actually largely consistent, we would have to talk that out. Despite the fact that in many ways each of you seem to be saying different things, sort of touching on some points and seeming to diverge on others, but a divergence that may just be the difference between the perspective that one's taking. So like, the economist says, well, we want markets because that will generate positive externalities for the society. The person who's managing the firm says, we want profits. It's not necessarily, profits is our objective. And it's not, those aren't necessarily inconsistent, but from their perspective, that's the way they have to look at it. And that may be what we're seeing here. But I could ask you to talk amongst yourselves, but I think it's probably a good time to sort of introduce questions and perspectives from the floor, and then sort of work out some of the agreements and disagreements that you might have on the panel. Laurent?
Yes. Thank you, first of all, for a great presentation.
This is Laurent Dubois, who was in our last panel. He runs a soccer blog and is taught on soccer and politics, and is in romance studies and history.
Yeah, so I was going to say, first of all, have you ever heard of three-sided football, which was invented in the 1970s by a German situationists? And it's the idea is that if you put three teams on a field, it completely trips up the sort of some of the usual mechanisms and forces collaboration between teams. So
By football, you mean soccer?
Yes, I'm sorry, excuse me.
Yes.
I just switched for you. So soccer, three-sided soccer, but it's really not played in the United States. So. But the interesting thing, they had this insight, which is that essentially if you put three teams, then teams have to, and the goal is to have the fewest goals scored against you. So teams have to create these temporary alliances and so forth. But it's just a way of saying, in terms of the question of what's produced by the sport, I'm for instance kind of in sympathy with the Brazilian position on what you decided, in part because there is a way in which maybe one of the goals of sport should be to produce something fascinating and interesting to look at, and it may be more interesting to look at, it may be less interesting to look at people running around really fast than just to look at people building up a strategy or showing technical brilliance or whatever. So there's but what, I guess the question I wanted to ask, it seems to me one of the things that sports, the reason people are so excited about sports is that it generates a sense of drama, and so much of that drama is precisely because of the pushing the edge and the questions of morality that it raises. So, the most kind of generative moments in history of soccer are things like Maradona's hand of God or Zidane's headbutt, or moments where people push the envelope, and that's or just the kind of fan cultures which are based around also excessive displays of incredibly competitive behavior between fans and so forth. So there's all these things that it kind of produces that have to do with the fact that people are pushing the envelope within the rules, you know, and that's part of what it gives to people and why it becomes a site of incredibly interesting discussions about morality. So I don't know if that's, the question would be, how do we think about that factor, which is that in the culture of sport, you know, you're dealing with people wanting to and actually seeking out something that goes against the rules of the sport in some ways, right? Or wanting to see the hard hit, or wanting to see somebody, you know, and fans love to see it in a way, their team do something tricky that isn't quite, you know, okay. It certainly is true in soccer, and they really appreciate that almost more than they might of a kind of standard play. So, you know.
I mean, I'm happy to respond. I want to say that, in terms of the byproduct benefits, I sort of mentally divide them into two classes. And so one of them is audience value, and then another is kind of benefits for the participants themselves,
Right.
you know, some personal best and so forth. In terms of audience value, I think that does a huge amount of work in terms of just separating out and using the Farley definition of like whenever you have a gray region, athletes can seek to win, but they have to do so in a way which is consistent with the broader purposes of it.
Right.
And so conceiving of that in terms of audience value, it strikes me then as doing a lot of work in deciding the difference between permissible and impermissible gamesmanship strategies. And that is that, you know, is a particular exploit one that makes the game more interesting or not, right? So there are many classic examples like, and I'm not big on sports, but whoever it was, you know, the tennis player who stopped to tie his shoelaces before every single serve. So there was this famous incident of I don't know, people might know who it is, but tennis game, in order to throw his opponent, he stops, puts the balls down, puts the racket down, reties his shoelaces, serves. Next round, does the same thing again, right? Keeps doing it in order to exasperate the opponent. Now that would be impermissible in the sense that it makes the game unwatchable. But then there are lots of other innovations that actually wind up being quite interesting. And so insofar as they create, so the problem with that is it's inconsistent with the broader purposes of the sport.
But I don't know, like I teach sport as performance here at Duke, my clarification, and I do think what gets left out of the conversation about sport a lot by these definitions that you shared, or Gutton's definitions, or McElwain, or other people who talk about what is game, what is play, what is sport, they are aesthetic. So they have these other functions and purposes and you know, intrinsic arbitrary rules, values, things like that. But as you're hinting, they are aesthetic and performative. And so I was glad, Jan, right, to see you mention, you know, arts and the comparison. And when we talked about the dunk, I mean, you know, dunk gets you 2 points. All kinds of shots get you 2 points. But there's something more dramatic and aesthetically pleasing about the dunk, both because it pushes the body to its utmost in pursuit of excellence, but also because of the spectacular nature. Now, once something is seen again, like the first time or second time this tennis player tied his shoelaces, it added a dramatic narrative to the game. It made it interesting. It can be read on many levels. It's performative. But once it gets repeated over time and just becomes a delayed game, it's no longer interesting. So I think the performative nature of sport is terribly important, both in terms of aesthetics and then what sport performs, what it performs in society, and how it displays things like ethical values. And so I think it's tricky because it's easy for us to say that you know, sports value is within itself, it's played for that purpose, but that's if we could ever purify sport. And what we've been talking about a lot in my class is we can no longer separate sport from society. As much as we wish we could, we're beyond that point. So whether an athlete wants to be a role model or not, they either have to stand up and deny that function or fulfill that function or pay the consequences, right? And you know, I liked what you were saying, Greg, in terms of the gains that people get for winning. The other problem is there's severe penalties for losing. You know, coaches lose their jobs, their families can't be fed, athletes lose their chance to play, scholarships are lost. I mean, there's so much at stake that's lost, not just what you gain by winning. And so I think we can no longer separate the intrinsic value of sport and play from social consequences and social readings of that. And I guess it's how that conversation begins to acknowledge that. So we can theoretically separate sport, but we can no longer functionally separate sport from society.
And I don't want to, and I agree thoroughly, several things you said, and I think the drama, I think each event is a dramatic performance. It is a performance, and it's the process that you want to see the whole process in order to get to whatever the outcome is. And so I think that while you're right, you can't separate the intrinsic from the social value that it has, but I think by using a paradigm, it gives us a model to sort of look to see when it is we need to change the rules. Like we've probably changed this rule now, it's 30, you only have a certain few seconds in order to make your next serve, right? And it's true, we do push the envelope to make things more interesting, but there are also things that we do like the taunting, the gyrations, the excessive celebration, right? We changed those were really interesting, people wanted to see them. But why did we change them? Because it showed a lack of civility. So I think we do change rules in order to have effect on society.
And
so
just to follow up on that, it may be that performance isn't governed by the same ethical rules.
Correct.
Like
Correct.
the way you celebrate after scoring a point, in its performative function, there is no ethical right or wrong about how to enact that performance. But within the frame of sport,
Right.
it takes on an ethical dimension. So like doing that action on stage in a play or a performance art piece or something like that would have a very different meaning than doing it within the frame of sport. And so we end up, these performance aspects can be threatening to in an ethical
Correct.
dimension, which is interesting. But it does make the performance less dynamic and interesting the more you start stripping those away. Maybe the reason they get control is because in the world of performance there is no ethical value to an aesthetic act.
I want to bring up two.
Because fighting in hockey is a good example.
Exactly.
Right.
Right.
Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so fans actually sometimes serve to pervert the very nature of sports. So we want to see, I mean, Dennis Rodman is
That's
my
if you
favorite
assume that
target.
performance isn't, I think the nature of sport also includes the aesthetic performative
It does, but
motion of
it's
the
not,
body.
that's
And
right.
that's getting suppressed by ethics sometimes.
But I think that so two things I want to bring up and then about the survey that we did, and the USADA report should be out hopefully in January because it's really a pretty powerful thing on youth in America. But 90% of those surveyed said that well-known athletes have a responsibility to be a positive role model for young people. Okay? And by wide margins agree that the personal conduct of well-known athletes is as important as their athletic accomplishments. So the people watching the sport also think. Right? The other one is that the number one influence on youth sport participants is the number one person who's the influence on the youth participant are the coaches. Above family, teachers, religion, everything that's not the top one is coaches. And so that's, we do teach them in the gamesmanship the things, how to be tricky and so forth. And when you said about your 6-year-old, I thought, I bet he said that was unfair.
Yeah, sure. Sure.
The 3-year-old unfortunately didn't have the words to be able to say,
Right.
the fact that he's 3 years older than me. So.
Right.
We get the top citizen check.
Yeah,
Just level the playing field.
right. I wanted to talk a couple things about, so you talk about the celebration and sometimes the ethics suppresses that. And I think what we look at that is it flies in the face of respect.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So that's a disrespect for the opponent if we do that. And the other thing about the role model, it's interesting, Leslie and Scott are sitting back here. The three of us run our leadership program for our student athletes here at Duke, and we talk to our athletes all the time about the fact that you are role models. Whether that's, we should do that or not, or whether they should be role models, that's a different question. Should. But the reality is that they are. My children wear Duke jerseys. They're looking at, I have a son who plays football, so he's looking at all the football players. He's wearing their jerseys, and they go and watch the games, and they look up to these people. Whether they should or not, we have that discussion all the time. But that's the message that we're sending to these
And
student
I'm just
athletes.
pointing out
Is
that's
that,
another layer of performance. That's another role.
Right.
Like in Irving Bachman's
Yes.
sense, it's a performance. And
Right.
so that just when you look at it through the lens of performance, you can read these things in interesting ways.
Sure.
Not that I agree that we should
Yes.
be reaching ethics in sports
Right.
and performing
yes.
things that
Yeah,
are
yes.
unhealthy for children.
right,
But there is that dimension.
right.
It also depends. I mean, it depends on the sport, right? I mean, in soccer, partly because it's so rare that someone actually scores goals.
Yes. Right.
The
Take the shirts off
celebration
and-
is a huge part of it.
Very
There are
nice.
some rules about it, but no one would
Right.
ever dream of saying like, just calm down.
Right.
Don't insult the other team, right? It's part of what.
Well, it's interesting, like
Also
the taking off of the
However,
jersey.
Yes.
the Brandy Chastain.
Right, the Brandy Chastain is a classic example of like then some, whether the line is pushed, although that was an example of just that's the classic celebration in soccer.
Right.
But the other thing I think, it's so interesting interesting with FIFA because, of course, there's so many debates in soccer around kind of wanting about refereeing decisions and
Yes.
video replay and all that kind of
Replay,
stuff.
right.
And they're so insistent on not wanting to change the flow of the game, even though that makes the game more unfair. So there's a sense like you just have to deal with unfairness if you want the drama that we provide through soccer. And that's just what that's what they're always telling people who are
Life is unfair.
Life is unfair, so is soccer. That's what it is. And but that's this is FIFA is a powerful institutional force. But it's interesting the choices that different bodies make about them.
But they did adopt some of the replay, right? They have adopted some, in some games, I think in the.
Some extra officials to watch.
Just extra officials, but they're completely against. They've steadfastly refused any form of video.
There's one. There was one competition, and it was an international competition where they did show replay and actually reversed the decision shortly after the World Cup. So,
Yeah, there was an
did show-
incident during the World Cup that, it was a game I was actually at where the people by mistake showed the replay on the screen in the stadium. And so actually, although the video clearly showed that it was an offside goal, this is for a goal, the referee didn't reverse the decision because if he had, it would have been clear that he had done so based on the video. You understand what I'm saying?
Right,
In other words,
exactly. But there has been one recent where
And more
where the
recently,
change was
yeah,
made
that's
the other way. Yeah, so it's going to be interesting in baseball, for instance, in the replays and so forth. Yeah, so.
Yeah, I mean, just so we have something to argue about, I just want to say that, yeah, I'm really with Mark on this, that I actually think that holding athletes up as role models is an enormous mistake that I would never do to my children.
As a society,
Yeah,
allowing this to happen.
it's like
right?
encouraging them to believe in Santa Claus, and it simply sets them up for later disappointment. But also that it misconstrues what the moral value of sport is. I think that is. I think that's why it's important, and I was emphasizing so much the non-cooperative aspect of competition. There is something fundamentally antisocial about competitive behavior, which we are harnessing for broader social purposes, but that does not change the fact that the behavior itself is antisocial. And so we should not be creating the illusion with people that we encourage all this competition because that's how it's good to behave in the world. That's not how it's good to behave in the world in a lot of circumstances.
But it's.
I mean, one of the reasons why I'm not particularly good at a lot of sports, some of that's physical, but also
Because you're such a nice person.
Yes.
it's because I feel sympathy for the person I'm beating. I mean, so being now old and atrophied, I do competition mainly in the form of online gaming. But I hate one-on-one which has all the same issues. And I like team, at least with 4 or 5 people going, right? Because one-on-one, once I start running up the score by about 5 or 6 on the person, then I start giving them a chance. And the people who win those things will run it up to 20, 30, 40, and will laugh at your face, right? Because they have no compunction whatsoever about humiliating you. Whereas I start to get that sort of, this is getting a little unpleasant, right? And then I pull my punches, right? So there is an antisocial impulse, and a lot of great competitors have a powerfully antisocial impulse. It's just that what they've learned, and this is the social value of sport, they've learned to control it. They can turn it on and they can turn it off. And that's the value, I think, of sports for young people, and particularly because of the artificialness of it. Is we say, okay, get out there and kill them, right? So in other words, act on your antisocial impulses. And then a whistle blows, now you stop. That's hard to do.
But don't
And
we
in
all
fact, that's
know
really
how
hard
to
for
two
kids.
different people on the court and off? And I could name 5 student athletes at Duke right now who are completely different human beings in the classroom and in their life, and then turn into something else on the court.
Yeah, that's the classic sort of, and that's, I mean,
Yeah.
that should, the ideal of the sort of gentleman athletes on like that, is precisely that they can be intense competitors in the context of the game. But then when the whistle blows, then they stop and you help the person get up.
Well,
or
they can
whatever.
be mean and they can be nice.
Now what you're doing though is you're switching from a non-cooperative to a cooperative orientation. And you're not allowing the feelings that build up when you're in that competitive interaction to flow over and then to contaminate and to prevent you from acting in a properly cooperative and moral fashion. So I think that a lot of the value of sport is that we teach people how to shift from one orientation to the other so that they don't act like a jerk in every aspect of their life. They learn to control it. And that is huge self-control
But I
involved
think
in doing
two
that.
things. Some people can't. Some of the problem is some people don't do it. But I think you actually miss a lot with saying that it's only competition, because you can't have the games without a whole lot of cooperation. And especially in team sports, I think that's why you want to have team sports, is because it does emphasize cooperation. And the only way you're going to improve is to be better, is to talent test, right? You're testing yourself against somebody else. It's the same thing you do in the classroom. It's the same thing whether you do music, whether you do art. You have to test yourself against the best. It's the only way you are going to develop. And as a team, you can't do it. I mean, you've got to have 5 players, and they all have different roles. They're all treated differently in some ways, but there's a shared end, and the shared end is pretty much understood. It is a desire to win, but not to win at all costs, and I think that's the slip we do. We all have the desire to win. I would bet very few people don't have desire to win in some aspect, but that doesn't mean that because we have the desire that we win at all costs, which is the misinterpretation of Vince Lombardi. He didn't say winning was the only thing. He said the desire to win is, and that's the same thing we want our kids to do, whether it's in sports or whether it's in education. And one of the things that you didn't mention is what parents and what kids want best in sports is to do their best. Learn how to do their best and to no matter what. And so there's levels, right? So and yet, you know, the biggest problem in this study was also that sport overemphasizes winning, even though we don't, but we think everybody else does, right? And so it's kind of interesting, this disconnect. So I think you misrepresent in some ways and say that it's only competition. There is competition, but you know, there's more. I think there's more cooperation in playing in sports than what you're allowing, because you have to abide. It's true you do turn it off sometimes, but most of the times, and I would say that in having done with basketball for so many years and even field hockey, the players are all pretty much friends, right? The ones who aren't is the spectators, right? It's the Duke that hates Carolina, the Carolina hates Duke. But the players aren't that way, right? The players and the coaches. I mean, my best friends are some of the Duke coaches, right? And so, and of all the coaches. So I think that it's a misrepresentation to say that, you know, it's schizophrenic in a way, but it's not something which is emphasizes only the winning. And I think
No, I didn't mean to say that. And in fact, I had written down here a thing on team sports, because team sports, I think, use the same mechanism and add an additional layer of complexity to it, where it's all about managing competitive versus cooperative behavior. And part of the trick that team sports adds to the mix, above and beyond the individual, is that then you have to be able to, amongst the players, differentiate those with whom you're supposed to be cooperating and those with whom you're not.
Right. And we do
so
that
you have
in
to train
society.
kids like not to be a ball hog and things like
Right.
that.
And we do it in society as well. But I think the other thing about role models, it may not that you don't want the athletes to be role models, but there's a couple things to think about. One, that's why I say sports are freely chosen voluntary activities. If you don't want to take the responsibility of being an influencer, don't do it, right? We as professors are, right? There's certain things we can't do, right? So once you accept a position, you've also accepted with it the obligations that go with it. One is you're a public figure, right? And that's the difference with sports and say other things because it's played in a public forum. And so you have to accept some of the consequences of accepting that position. Right? Once you become a representative of the university, you can't do certain things. You may want to, right? But you can't do them. So there's no. So in that sense, is I think what we mean about being a role model. If you have obligations, you have to abide by. What's his name? Barkley. Yes. Yeah. Who actually? I did do the Olympics when Barkley was on the Dream Team, and I have to say he was one of the nicest guys there. He used to. He was really one of the nicest guys.
I mean, like, you're a mall Santa Claus, like, given that the kids think you're Santa Claus. I shouldn't spoil it for you, but the question is whether the kids should think you're Santa Claus or not. I mean, so,
I'd be interested to hear how you
given that people treat you as a role model, you should actually say,
No. It's not that people treat you as a role model. It's that you have the obligation not to do certain things that influence others. That's not. That's what a role model is somebody who allows you, who's influencing.
Ultimately, it's not their choice.
Right.
It's not their choice of if they're a role model or not. It's other people choosing for them to be a role model. So it's ultimately
because of the notoriety of athletes.
right.
So I have I'm sorry, I interrupted you there. Were you finished?
I'm used to it. Okay.
Yes, usual.
Well, can I make one more
Yes,
comment?
sure.
The usual.
Yes.
The usual.
Yes.
Yes. I think we do have to be very careful. I think that there is a difference between being competitive and being mean. When we say they're mean on the court and they're nice off the court or on the track, I'm a runner, and trust me, I've probably been called a little yache out there sometimes. But at the end of the race, I'm gonna be the first one to come up to someone behind me and tell them a great race. Like, so, yeah, is that mean? And kind of, but off the, when I'm not running and competing out there, am I like that? Absolutely not. So I think that, and I think it's very important for us as educators with the language that we use with these young people, and especially with the athletes. So when we use the terms loosely, like being mean and being this, because they're taking that, and if they are considered role models, they're talking to some of our youth out there too. And I think that's where some of those messages can sometimes.
Well, and the
get mixed
sporting
up.
event is not the real world, so with the behavior or meanness, niceness, competitive, non-competitiveness, cooperation, it's a performative realm. It is a performance, and it performs different things, including competition, but it's not the enactment of performance in their real lives. So they can play a different character in the frame of a sporting event than they play elsewhere. But
Yes
I
and
think
no.
the role.
I would argue yes and no.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think it should be, things should be complex. They're not black and white.
Yeah.
But I think that role that they play outside of the sporting event is, just as impactful, if not more, in terms of how they're set up as a model and what they do on the court.
A father of one of the children that my 12-year-old son goes to school with came up to me and said, my son would like for me to buy him a Michael Vick football jersey for his birthday.
When was this?
This was 6 months ago.
It's okay now.
Right, this was 6 months ago.
Is it a green jersey? That's
Right. So what do you think? Is it okay to buy Michael Vick? Would you buy your son a Michael Vick? Oh, that's really the only thing he wants.
I don't know who he is.
Oh, it's right. So,
I just thought it was Canada.
right. That's why I thought you might not do it.
Yeah.
But he was accused of,
Convicted.
in jail for dogfighting.
All right, yeah,
Yes.
so he's like the 21st century person.
Yes.
Then he did his time.
But he did his time.
And he worked hard.
Yes.
Now he's back.
Yes.
And now he's trying to save dogs
And he
Yeah.
was given
For
the
the-
award as soon as he came back. He was given
Well,
the,
it's choice, but he's-
what was the award he was given?
For-
A role
from the-
model award.
Is that right? Yes.
Right.
And so I guess my point is that as much as we'd like to not have people perhaps like that, his child is looking to him and wants to emulate him in some fashion. Hopefully, perhaps just on the football field, but can he separate those two? I think it's difficult.
So one of the interesting things that's going on here is that there's an interesting parallel between what people like least about the behavior of athletes and what they like most about it. Both of them involve the same thing, namely that you're never just in the game, that's a particular sport. You're also in this other larger thing, which may also be a kind of competitive world or just a larger. You have another role. So what we hate worst is the athlete who is really trying to win at all costs just because he or she is trying to get a bigger contract, trying to become more famous, trying to get more fans, trying to move to the next league, or just trying to get a scholarship in a university or something like that. And so their game is actually bigger than what's going on in the field. Their game is this competitive game of life that they're playing. And the role model thing is similar, saying, don't forget, you're not just this player in this thing, you're also this actor in this other context that has these other obligations put on it. And so it's really the same point in both cases, that you can only get so far by sort of imagining that what you're doing is talking about the ethics of the things that happen within the boundaries of this sporting field, that there's some other lens in which the person is in a
Yeah, and I happen to agree with Joe. I think that it's difficult to expect athletes to be these great virtuous athletes and coaches, because the only thing we value is winning. There's no place for second place in our society. I'm not sure about what it is in Canada. I would imagine
We're
it's
used
pretty
to
close.
it.
Pretty close.
Second still sucks a bit.
Yeah, and it's not so much, I guess not so much that winning is everything, but everything else doesn't matter at all. There's no value to that. And so we say that, but then we want you to behave virtuously on this field and win, and that's very difficult.
I think one of the things we want to ask back to something you guys are talking about is, the parents, and you're asking, what is it that sport teaches you? I bet if they knew that they weren't really going to be talked about, they would say, how to win.
Oh, absolutely.
Yes.
Sure. That's what it's going to do. And when we think about it,
Right.
then all those things that you're talking about, teaching to pull jerseys and all that, and the people above, are they ethically and morally acting correctly? And somebody brought up, I don't know who it was, about the cheerleader thing.
Yes, about whether it's a sport or not.
Yeah, I have a neighbor whose daughter is hook, line, and sinker into this, and they are as well. And when that whole thing went and they brought the guy in court to talk about whether it was a sport or not, he said no. You know why? Because it would hurt his business. He's the guy who runs all the competitions. So if you regulate it, he's out of business. So of course he's going to say, no, it's not a sport. Right? I'm going to lose however many hundreds of thousands of, right? So that gets me to thinking, what's the economic drive to sport, right? And our moral and ethical. When we think about it, the old phrase is, to the victor goes the spoils.
Right.
And back to Greek and ancient times, you won, you got the spoils, which could include all kinds of things from food and wine and women to where you lived. And we think about the same thing nowadays. You know, there's a reason why people, they get a first down, they'll make some gesture because they want to get noticed. It's going to get them invited onto some TV show, some radio show, because we as a society bought into that as sport. You can't turn on the radio and listen to, you know, Green Day really wasn't on their top game last night in that concert. And the day long dedicated to that. Or, you know, Bono was a lot too last night. Not that nobody cares, but you're not going to hear that. But you're going to hear about, okay, Brett Favre, elbow, ankle, pictures. We're going to dedicate weeks to that. I mean, ESPN could have their own channel. They could have ESPN Parr.
Yes.
People would sponsor it and buy into it.
Right.
So is the factor of the economic gain, how much is that an influence for the moral and ethical character of people involved?
I think a couple of things to that. I don't know if you've read the book Soul Influence. Talks about the Adidas, Converse, and Nike, right? And that's
Sonny Vaccaro?
Sonny Vaccaro's in, right. But James Michener, in a book many years ago, wrote that television is the main source of some of the undermining or perverting sport. And I think that's right, because you're right, you see it, and it's there. And I think we see the same thing we see in war, right? Why was the Vietnam War so powerful? Because it was brought in our faces, and I think that the television has done a lot. But I think we look at the economics is certainly a big factor, including the NCAA. I mean, the NCAA lives by the sports, and so they need to have a certain amount of things.
It's hard when your majority of your job is to advertise,
Yeah.
and then you have the small section, oh yeah, here's our regulation part.
Right. Right.
You know?
So most sports, but not baseball, function with a clock. So if it was like baseball, everybody would get their chance to talk, and then once it's all done.
Yes, right.
Cricket actually functions with a calendar. So if it rains on the 5th day of a 5-day test match, then it's just a draw.
Yeah.
But anyway, this particular event has to go by the clock, and we're actually sort of in injury time right now. Limping along.
Claire has an announcement.
No, Rebecca, it's your event.
But we can sort of give people a chance to and some people obviously have schedules and being patient, and we can kind of talk informally after. Can I just then, as we transition to the informal, just thank the 3 panelists, and I would continue to talk to you.
Okay, directly after this, we are going to, those of you who are available, walk over to King's Daughters and to the parlor. It's 2 minutes. That way we have a little wine and cheese so we can continue the discussion.
Yeah, please come, please come.
You'd like to come back.
Why are you showing photos?
What's that? Produced by Duke University. Online at duke.edu.